Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan. I'm immensely privileged to be here to share the story to you all. And I think there's a big global implication of the case of Hong Kong and also what we've been through as a group of people, as a community, as a city in the past few years, and to a certain extent to last past decades. I've left Hong Kong 4 years ago. I'm now based in London. I'm a political refugee. I have a bounty worth 140,000 US dollars. Anyone who have information of my whereabouts and lead to my arrest in Hong Kong, you can claim that, and technically you can claim it now, though it is not a big sum of money and it takes more for you to smuggle me back to Hong Kong. I also don't know when I can go back to Hong Kong. I have immense love to the city. I have a lot of friends still there, friends who are outside of prison, friends who are behind bars. And it's fairly difficult for many of you to contemplate. You actually don't know when you can go back, but that is the reality of Hong Kong. For me, Hong Kong is a personal story. For some of you, it may be like an academic case study or a news on the TV channels, on legacy media. But for me, it's about human beings. It's about my friends. And it's about the love of my city. And as all you have been aware, the city of Hong Kong changed a lot. 1 year ago, there was a man who wanted to have some fun on social media. So he changed the clip, the music of the clip when there was an athlete won the gold medal in Tokyo Olympics. And he changed the anthem of the national anthem of China to Hong Kong to kind of stage a funny clip. And he was sentenced to 3 months of jail because of stigmatizing the national anthem of China. And the Hong Kong government issued a court case, and the court also complied with that, that for now, playing that protest anthem, Glory to Hong Kong, is no longer allowed in Hong Kong. It is being banned in all streaming platforms and all kind of music channels. This is a flag that we used in 2019 protest, where you saw a lot of news around Hong Kong. And in today's Hong Kong, flagging it is illegal. There was a man 2 years ago when he was showing the flag outside of his flat. He was arrested just because he demonstrated a protest-related material. And that was really scary because it was just a show of freedom of expression, and then the Hong Kong government would go after you because of doing that. And also for a landmark case, it has been on the global headlines. There were a few dozen Hong Kong politicians, the brightest and greatest democratic activists in Hong Kong. They are being trialed because they were involved in a primary election, which, to be honest, every democratic parties would do. But what happened was, in 2020 June, there were 600,000 Hong Kong people turn out and vote in this primary election. And in December, all the participants and organizers, they were arrested because the government claims that if you want to get the majority in the legislature, if you want to block government's bill, you are subverting the state. So they are being charged with conspiracy to subvert the state. And many of them, including many of my friends, who've been in jail for more than 3.5 years without a verdict. So this is the reality of Hong Kong. This is the reality of the ones being renounced as the freest, one of the freest city in Asia, the Pearl of Orient, but for now has become a police state, an authoritarian police state. So what has happened? Why the city of Hong Kong has become that way? And it starts with my story. I was born in 1993 in mainland China. I was not born in Hong Kong. I moved to Hong Kong in 1999 with my mom. And it was a classic Hong Kong-China marriage. My father worked in Hong Kong because the salary was much higher than mainland China. And my mom and 3 of us stayed in China, in the bordering city Shenzhen. And I was growing up there until I was 6 and then moved to Hong Kong. And my father also wasn't born in Hong Kong. My father, in late 70s, when he was 20s, he actually smuggled from mainland China to Hong Kong. Back then, in his peasant village, there wasn't enough food. So the only hope of survival for a lot of people in southern Guangdong, which is the southern part of China, bordering Hong Kong, was to escape to Hong Kong, because by then, Hong Kong was already very established and a great economic port. So my father took a very rough trip, 3 days, seeing so many floating bodies. And he was lucky that he managed to come to Hong Kong, and there was a policy, whoever reached the city center, escaping the border control, border patrolling police, he could get a citizenship. And he did that. On the next day, on the very first day of him working as a construction worker in Hong Kong, he earned more than a year of salary than in mainland China. So that was the status of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a city of hope, a city of refuge. And as you know, that's the reason why Hong Kong people in 70s and 80s were fairly scared that they were going back to China's sovereignty. In the 80s, the future of Hong Kong was under negotiation. Hong Kong was deemed to be going back, quote unquote, to the Chinese sovereignty, and there was a negotiation ongoing, and Hong Kong people were nervous because by then, Hong Kong was already a financial center, have really vibrant economic activities, but China was still relatively in still a very closed economy, very socialist, and Hong Kong people were worried that whether their life will be compromised, whether they can continue their way of living. And that's the reason why in the 80s, there were a couple waves of immigration. There were so many Hong Kong people went to Australia, went to Canada, went to the UK, just because they were worried about the future of Hong Kong under the Chinese ruling. In the 80s, Hong Kong people felt like it was the best of time. The discussion of colonialism in Hong Kong was rather special, was rather different, because they felt like at least the Brits have laid down a solid financial foundation for them. And in turns, in 1997, when they were supposed to go back to the Chinese sovereignty, they were going back to a state where the politics was much more closed, was much more authoritarian, and they didn't know what to do. In 1984, the Chinese and the British government signed a treaty to confirm that in the future, Hong Kong will go back to Chinese sovereignty, governance, but with the promise that Hong Kong people would enjoy freedom and gradual process to democracy. And that was the reason why there were one country, two systems, there were basic law, all these framework trying to separate the system of Hong Kong from China, because back then, the Chinese government and the British government didn't want Hong Kong people to leave. They want to appease, they want to comfort Hong Kong people, saying that, look, we know that you are worried, but we promise that once you go back to Chinese sovereignty, your life will be as usual. It was just one flag up and one flag down. So that was the expectation of Hong Kong people, and that was what the Chinese and the British government wanted to appease Hong Kong people, to stop them from leaving. But unfortunately, one thing that took place exacerbated the whole situation. In 1989, there was a massive democratic movement in mainland China. Workers, students, they were demanding free speech, they were demanding less corruption, they were demanding a more transparent and democratic government. And the Tiananmen massacre took place on June 4th, 1989. We still don't know how many people died on that day. It is said that thousands or even tens of thousands. There are no unclassified record, there were no orchestrated or any sort of investigation could be done because of the political climate there. But that shocked Hong Kong. Hong Kong was one of the outposts that held massive protests, and there were more than 1,500,000 Hong Kong people marched to the street. That was 1/4 of the population in 1989. They were immensely impacted by the Tiananmen massacre. And then subsequently, When Beijing, they thought that, oh, we have the signed the British Joint Declaration, we have the treaty signed, we promise you freedom and democracy. But eventually, there were another wave of immigration. A lot of Hong Kong people left Hong Kong, and they had a show of preference by feet. So that was the immense insecurity and doubt cast to the Chinese government. After 1997, there was actually a honeymoon period of Hong Kong under the Chinese ruling. In 2003, that was the very first time the Chinese government wanted to introduce the national security law in Hong Kong, which for now it has already introduced in 2019 and 2023. But back in 2003, the Chinese government wanted to roll out a bill that widely considered infringing Hong Kong people's freedom and liberty. Hong Kong people pushed back. We had a 500,000 rally. We had so much pressure, pushback from the civil society, and we actually concurred. We prevailed. The Beijing government shelved the bill, and Hong Kong people felt like, oh, it was actually a healthy interaction. So I would say that in the first 10 years of Hong Kong under the Chinese ruling, it was relatively peaceful. Hong Kong people had faith in the Chinese government restraining themselves not to overstep, respecting the boundary, respecting Hong Kong people's way of life. In the year 2008, we can argue that with the Beijing Olympic, it was the peak of Beijing's soft power. Looking at Hong Kong's people's identity, it is academically speaking as a form of portraying Hong Kong people's approval to the government. I saw there are some glitches in the graph. So this graph basically shows that how Hong Kong people identify themselves. The blue one is identifying themselves as Chinese. The green one is Hong Konger. The higher Hong Kong people identify themselves as Chinese, it means that they are more approved of China's governance. And you can see it in the graph in the year 2008. It was the peak of that, which means that Hong Kong people were actually quite happy. And I remember I was still a high school student. In the Beijing Olympic, I lived in public housing with my family. I heard cheering whenever Chinese national team got a gold medal, and I was also cheering for them because I think that was a great thing. China has finally stepped up. They have been seen, and they are a great power that deserves people's respect. So when people ask about Hong Kong, whether Hong Kong people, they were innately rebellion, they were innately non-Chinese, that is a wrong observation. There had been a period of time when we perceived the Beijing government respecting the boundary of one country, two system, respecting the freedoms of Hong Kong people, and trying to deliver the promise of gradual process to democracy. Hong Kong people were quite happy to be part of it. But what happened was, after 2008, after 2010, and even after Xi Jinping took power in 2012, the intervention of the Chinese regime to Hong Kong increased. There were more and more cases showing that Hong Kong people's liberty are fading. The Chinese regime trying to impose their political order in Hong Kong instead of respecting Hong Kong people's way of life, respecting the status of the city as being free and having the hope to gradual process of democracy. When I was in high school, I didn't know much about politics. As I said, my father was a construction worker. My mother was a street cleaner. We were living in a blue-collar family. My education about human rights and democracy was not taught in my family. My political enlightenment took place when I was in high school. In 2010, I first attended the candlelight vigil commemorating the fallen in Tiananmen Square. And actually, Hong Kong, from the year 1989 to 2022, it was the only place in China that could publicly talk about the Tiananmen massacre and had a candlelight vigil commemorating the fallen. I was invited by a friend, and I didn't know much about it. It was a rainy night, and I went, and I saw a lot of clips. I saw a lot of histories. And I saw people who were my similar age, who looked like me, but they were chanting global slogans. They were chanting things that they care about, things that they eventually sacrificed for. It was about ending one-party dictatorship, freedom, less corruption. And for me, it was really impactful. By the time I chanted slogan with the MCs of the candlelight vigil, I felt like I had a responsibility to do those things. And that is the empowerment of free speech. That is the power of being able to freely chant and lead your fellow citizens to achieve what you want, to commit themselves in their values. And that was the moment I decided to step in the path of student activism. Fast forward, in 2014, the Beijing government issued a white paper basically saying that there's no hope to Hong Kong's universal suffrage. And Hong Kong people were furious because you promised us that we have a gradual process to democracy. We have a system of freedom. We have a society that we can freely express and elect our leaders. But you betrayed your promise. And that's the reason why there was a huge urge of Hong Kong people trying to resist, because we were not asking for things that up in the air that was never gonna happen. We were actually asking Beijing government to deliver their promise. And the drive of asking something that you felt you deserve is huge. It's much larger than asking something that you are not intended to have. So that was what happened in 2014. When Hong Kong people knew that Beijing closed the door for universal suffrage, they marched down to the street. And I was one of the student leaders in my student union, and I somehow caught in this big protest, big era, and I became a public figure. I became one of the student leaders people could recognize. In 2014, the umbrella movement, there were hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong people occupied the major runway of Hong Kong. It was the very first massive civil disobedience in Hong Kong's history and very first occupation movement in the city. It was impactful, it was massive, and it was triggered by the deep sense of betrayal Hong Kong people felt when Beijing refused to honor its promises. But of course, after 79 days of occupation, we ended up in vain. The Beijing government didn't compromise. They still maintain a very hard line. They still feel like they are trying to centralize all power, and all Hong Kong people are just being spoiled. They were just spoiled citizens trying to ask for basic rights. And then for me, I continue my activism as a political leader, as a politician. And in the year 2016, I won a legislative election. I became the youngest ever elected parliamentarian, congressman, legislator in Hong Kong at the age of 23. And then I was imprisoned because of my participation in the umbrella movement for a couple of months. And I was seen as the first batch of political prisoners in Hong Kong. And meanwhile, I was disqualified. My seat got taken away because I quoted Gandhi in my oath-taking session, and Beijing had a whole legal scandal to reinterpret and reinstitute new restrictions and apply it retrospectively. To put long story short, what I've been through for these few years was a reflection of how Beijing was interfering our own system. They're trying to take away our voice. They're trying to put more punishment on activists who are campaigning for freedom, and they're stepping up the pressure. And Hong Kong people definitely felt it. Joshua Wall, one of my dearest friends, who we found the party together, who helped me run for the election, was sentenced several times because of peaceful advocacy work. And for now, he is still in jail. He is part of the 47, the primary election case, and he's been in jail for more than 3.5 years. I have no idea when I could see him, and have no idea when he could leave prison. The pressure mounted Hong Kong people were so upset about all these political crackdowns and intervention. And it was up to a point when people's confidence towards the one-country system gradually dropped to a historical low, approaching to the year 2019. And in the year 2019, I'm sure many of you have seen clips, footages, news on TV channels that there was a massive protest in Hong Kong took place. More than 2 million people marched down to the street. There was also more than a quarter of population of Hong Kong. Just try to imagine if there was more than a quarter of population in one of the big cities of the US or the whole US coming out. Things would change, right? The government will listen to the demand of shelving an extradition bill, the demand for democracy, the demand for accountability of police violence. But the government refused to do it because they don't need to. They don't have any accountability to the public, and they are not elected by us. So the government stepped up the crackdowns. They were firing all these rubber bullets. They are raiding all these protesters, and they were arresting kids at the age of 13, and doing all these things with complete police immunity. There has been no police officers being charged of whatsoever crime or police brutality that they've committed throughout the whole 2019-2020 crackdown, even though they are widely documented, and there have been tens or even hundreds of cases of their misuse of police force. And with that kind of crackdown, we're seeing, of course, this is also some glitches on the slide. We're seeing the dissatisfaction rate to the government drop to historical low, around 80% in the year 2019, when the crackdown was ongoing. Hong Kong people were upset. We were promised democracy, we were promised freedom, but the Beijing government didn't deliver their promise. And we used a lot of creative ways to resist, including taking reference from the Baltic ways. So we hold hands in the city center of Hong Kong, and we form a human chain that demonstrates our determination to fight for democracy. We have all these lantern walls that was inspired by the spring, and we have all these lantern walls all over Hong Kong, writing down the hopes and fears and demands of Hong Kong people, and it was beautifully seen. But also, we have an escalation of force as well. When there was an unchecked police brutality, unchecked government power, people had also stepped up their use of force to either protect themselves or to pose deterrence, in fact, to the police. And there were scenes where you saw petrol bombs and bricks flying over the Hong Kong's gorgeous night views, which was surreal. But that was also the consequence of government pushing boundaries, pushing borderlines of citizens, and they rise up and resist. And so after months of unrest, the government finally said that they're going to annihilate the whole civil society in order to prevent the next uprising. So in 2020, July, they published the National Security Law. The NPCSC, the Standing Committee member of the National People's Congress, which was a political body, they circumvented all the local legislation and consultation process in Hong Kong. They directly imposed the National Security Law, which is a very convenient legal weapon to prosecute and to annihilate dissident voice, different voice. They basically weaponized the concept of national security and apply it to all perspective. For me, I am wanted because I attended congressional hearings, because I talked to government officials, or simply because I talked to you all. The government wanted me because I am doing an act of subversion. I am doing an act of colluding with foreign forces. And I'm sure that Vanderbilt University will be part of them. But not only the freedom of political participation and the fear instilled in political activists, As I said, Hong Kong used to be the only place in China that could publicly commemorate the Tiananmen massacre. It was seen as a proof of freedom of assembly, but it's gone already. Starting from the year 2022, Hong Kong government banned the whole candlelight vigil commemoration. The commemoration was there for more than 3 decades. Every year since 1989, there were tens of thousands of Hong Kong people turn up to commemorate that event. But it is gone now because of the impact of the national security law and the tightened control of the Hong Kong government. And then we see how the Hong Kong government has restructured, has overhauled the whole election system. On the year that I was elected as a parliamentarian, as a congressman in Hong Kong, there were roughly half of the seats were through direct election. But after the government witnessed the power of people, they have changed the whole election system, and for now, we have less than a quarter of the seats were through direct elections. Most of the others were direct appointees from the Beijing government, and they have rolled back the process of democracy, and this is one of the playbook. The freedom of political representation has also strengthened under the new crackdown of Hong Kong. And it's also not about ballot box, it's also about library shelves. Books of politicians, political activists, even though they were about novels, they were about their life, they were about Hong Kong pop culture, they were completely off shelf. If you think that that's only applied to political dissidents, you're mostly wrong. There were also a lot of journalists who were critical to the government, who were being seen as quote-unquote troublemakers by writing op-eds criticizing government policy. Their books are also off-shelf from library as well. Not only working on these bookshelves, but for the freedom from fear, the Hong Kong government also has some work on it. They have a tip line for the national security law, which they received so many reports, and that has instilled fear in all these communities and units and families and schools and communities that, well, maybe people besides you, they are not just that trustworthy, and it makes you afraid of expressing your political opinion because that could be as an evidence to you, not necessarily putting you in jail, but at least impacting your jobs and impacting your well-being. And not only in the civil society, but the government has also introduced the National Security Courts, which they have appointed judges. They don't have jury, and they have a really vaguely written laws with no sentencing guideline. So basically, all the arrestees, defendants that I mentioned in the primary election case, how long they end up in jail was at the mercy of the Chinese government and at the mercy of the appointees of the National Security Courts. And these things are not just limited to politicians. Journalists are being persecuted, harassed, their families are threatened, and the enablers are also limited to institutions in Hong Kong. The person you're seeing is the chair of the Hong Kong Journalists Association, which is a labor union for Hong Kong journalists. She was fired by Wall Street Journal because she took up the place and ran for the election and advocate for press freedom of Hong Kong. Sometimes enablers are not only limited to institutions in Hong Kong, but also there are a lot of boundaries, there are a lot of considerations, there are a lot of things that some of the Western institutions are doing and harming the city of Hong Kong. And for me, of course, there were also multiple harassment, raided to my family home, and threatened my loved ones. In a society with unchecked power, they no longer only act in the boundary of law. They're doing all these extra-legal things and also collective punishment. So your family, your loved one, your former colleagues, all of them, in my case, they were harassed and arrested with fabricated charges in order to put pressure on me and to demonstrate that there are still certain support in Hong Kong to an activist like me. So it's fairly difficult situation for Hong Kong, and I don't think we have any optimistic outlook in the short-term future. It's difficult for me to say things will be all right, or like I can go home in 5 years. I don't think that is the case. But for me, the reason why I'm standing here and I'm still fairly hopeful in a long-term future is that there are still so many Hong Kong people trying to resist, even though they are operating in such a tiny and very narrow civil society in Hong Kong, and we're building a stronger diasporic communities outside of Hong Kong. I want to end the talk with a quote that I like, which Jakob also mentioned his name multiple times in the opening remark, the Czech famous playwright and dissident Václav Havel. He wrote that, "We never decided to become dissidents. We have been transformed into them without quite knowing how. Sometimes we have ended up in prison without precisely knowing how. We simply went ahead and did certain things that we felt we ought to do and that seemed to us decent to do, nothing more, no less." And that was basically describing the whole generation of Hong Kong people. I never wanted to become a dissident. I never wanted to be political. But that was how the time and how the collective eagerness of protecting our hometown has driven us. And there are many, hundreds of thousands or even millions of Hong Kong people still having this mindset. They were driven to be a dissident, and they were not, they did not choose that. They were basically forced to do it. And I think that is a really powerful thing if we continue to believe that the innate freedom of human beings, the innate pursuit of freedom of human beings will eventually prevail. So the road ahead is difficult, and it's fairly difficult to say things that I think can change Hong Kong instantly or ask you to do to monitor the situation. But I really do hope that after today, Hong Kong, the issue of Hong Kong used to be for you just a news on TV or foreign story. But starting from today, I hope that you can also see the issue of Hong Kong as an experience of a friend and as an urge of a friend like me, and see it personal and attach to it and have emotional bonding with the story there, and continue to read, continue to write, continue to speak up, and continue to act. The freedom of Hong Kong is difficult. It's difficult to rebuild, and the civil society is in a collapse. But I genuinely think that the spirit of Hong Kong democracy will linger and will continue. It's just in a different format, and we still need your support in the future. Thank you so much.